Good evening. I'm Mark Boliat, the Chairman of the City's Policy and Resources Committee, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. I'd like to thank the Centre for Policy Studies for arranging this event. We've had a long and excellent working relationship with them. You don't need me to tell you that this has been a time of momentous political change in this country. Before I hand over to Tim Knox, I think it's appropriate for me to say on behalf of the City a big thank you to George Osborne for his work as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Indeed, I think the applause when you walked in was almost enough for me not to have to give this introduction. You've worked over a whole range of government policies, from tackling the deficit to something in which we've been very involved in the City, developing London as the Western hub for renminbi trading. That's enough from me. Can I now hand over to Tim Knox, who's going to say some words on behalf of the Centre. Tim.
Good evening. Before Maurice introduces George Osborne, I'd just like to thank Mark Boliat and his fantastic team here at the City of London, in particular Claire Holgate and Peter Cannon. They've been fantastic in putting together this marvellous event. I'd also like to say just a few words about our work at the Centre for Policy Studies. For these are very exciting times to be the director of London's leading independent think tank. At a time when the political kaleidoscope has been shaken so vigorously, the opportunities that face us are all the more enticing. Not that we've been doing that badly recently, not least because of George Osborne's reforming zeal, where he has taken on our ideas for taking millions of people out of the income tax system, where he has implemented the pension and savings revolution, which we have long advocated, and where he has obviously drastically cut corporation tax along the lines that we originally proposed. But we are relentlessly greedy, applying our founding principles of low tax, a competitive economy, a lean but strong nation state. We have 7 priorities in the years ahead. First of all, developing policies to enhance the competitiveness of the UK. Secondly, continuing to inspire a savings and pensions revolution. 3, to get Britain building housing again more quickly. Affordability and reliability of energy supply. Tax and legal simplification. Securing a long-term future for the NHS. And building a specialist China centre to help our leaders better understand China and for China to better understand the West. To do all this, we rely entirely on the generosity of our members and our donors. So I need your money. Support us, and you will not only receive copies of all our pamphlets and publications and events and invitations to events and seminars and so on, you will also be in the advance guard of policy development. All you need to do is complete the forms which you have on your chairs and hand it to one of my colleagues who are manning the table at the back of the hall. Thank you very much indeed.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Margaret Thatcher. I have the honour to be the chairman of the Centre for Policy Studies. What a very grand gathering you all make in such a grand setting, a fitting tribute to a very grand woman in Mrs. Thatcher. I want to thank Mark Boliat too, and the fine relationship which he very generously referred to between the Corporation of London and the City of London and the Centre for Policy Studies. We had a magnificent Thatcher conference on liberty here last year, and I'm hoping that we're going to have an equally spectacular Thatcher conference on security and defence here next year. We will see, and I hope you'll all be there. I'd like to explain that the CPS inaugurated the Margaret Thatcher lecture when Mrs. Thatcher was in hospital. She wasn't at all well, and she was certainly too weak to come to the inaugural lecture at Lancaster House, which was given brilliantly by Rupert Murdoch. But she sent me a message which she asked me to relay to the audience then, which I won't read it all to you. It expressed her delight that the CPS had inaugurated this lecture series and said that she was deeply honoured that the lecture was named after her, and she hoped it would go on and reflect the CPS values that Tim Knox just beautifully described. Rupert Murdoch gave the inaugural lecture. Boris Johnson, as Mayor of London, then gave the lecture, and her official biographer, Charles Moore, gave his lecture. They all did her proud. That's all I can say, and I have absolutely no doubt the same is going to happen here tonight. During the Charles Moore lecture, he described a scene which I'd like to describe to you, which is Mrs. Thatcher sitting on the floor of the original office of the original Centre for Policy Studies. And he describes that she was putting the plug on the first CPS kettle. But he explained that she wasn't really putting the plug on a kettle. What she was actually doing was rewiring conservatism. And that's what we've tried to do, and so has our brilliant guest of honour. So far as the guest of honour is concerned, well, there is a phrase in politics with which you're all familiar, which is, it's not personal, and usually that just precedes the moment when the knife goes into the back. But so I'm going to say tonight that so far as George Osborne is concerned, so far as I'm concerned, this is personal. Because I am very happy for historians to debate whether George Osborne is or isn't a great Chancellor of the Exchequer. They can discuss for years the employment statistics, the debt statistics, the inflation statistics, and whatever else they can do. They can go on with that for decades, and they will. I say to you, speaking personally, so far as I'm concerned, I'm not that interested in whether George Osborne is or isn't a great Chancellor of the Exchequer. So far as I'm concerned, what I'm interested in is that I believe that he is a great man. And I'm going to tell you exactly why, if you'll forgive me. Not too much sentiment, George. I'm going to tell you exactly why. Firstly, he had no reason to be here tonight at all. It would have been perfectly easy, and I'm certain it crossed his mind and those of his many brilliant advisors, to say, I don't need to do this. And they did say to me, by the way, he'll chuck. I said, I know he won't, and I know he'll be here. And of course, he is here. And I think this is the action of a great man. And I'm going to, if I may, George, continue for one more minute. You'll permit me and you'll understand. After 3 years, the grueling process of taking legislation through both houses of Parliament, the Access to Medical Treatments Act was received royal assent and was signed into law on the 23rd of March at exactly 11 p.m. by Her Majesty the Queen, presumably during her dinner. This would never have happened, let me assure you, my friends, if it was not for George Osborne. Because there were many moments, key moments during this legislation, which he remembers very well, when in crucial moments in Department of Health meetings, meetings in Whitehall, a person would appear in the room amongst all the officials, and there would be some query about why this person was here. And so the question would be, why are you here? This would be an official from the Treasury. And the answer was, the Chancellor is interested in this bill. And I can assure you, that was enough to do the trick. So, if I may, that's why I regard him as a great man, as they say, to go to the well with. You will all know that it's possible in politics to be completely anonymous and disappear without trace. Perhaps the greatest visual symbol of that, which George will be familiar with as an expert in American politics, is that there was an American presidential candidate who was called George McGovern. You may remember him. And his political career ended with one image, which was a camera following him through a snow-filled wood. And it showed that as he walked through the snow, he left no footprints behind. That was the end of George McGovern. That is never going to happen to George Osborne, because I think George Osborne, as I'm trying to say to you, I think he conforms with Alfred Lord Tennyson's version of a great man, which I can leave you with. Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing, leave behind us footprints on the sands of time. That's what our guest of honor has done. George Osborne.
Well, Maurice, thank you for that. It's very, very kind and humbling introduction. And let me repay the tribute, because you pushed that legislation through Parliament as a legacy to your wife. And I think it will help many other people in the future who will not know that they benefit from the kind of medical innovation that wouldn't legally be possible if we had not worked together to get that legislation through. And I'm glad that you and I worked together to defeat what is sometimes known as the blob, the establishment that wanted to do everything possible to kill your legislation. So thank you for that. Thank you for inviting me to speak tonight in honor of Margaret Thatcher under the auspices of this great free-thinking, free-market think tank. Tim, thank you for reminding me of the many good ideas that I nicked from you over those many budgets. And unlike Tim, I don't need your money anymore. So, of course, when I was invited to give this lecture, I held one of the great offices of state. And now I come to address you as a backbench member of Parliament, more ex than checker. But while the red boxes are gone, the important duties of Parliament remain. And tonight, in a few hours' time, all members of Parliament, myself included, will be asked to vote on the future of our independent nuclear deterrent, which I will absolutely do. And the renewal of the Trident weapon system that Margaret Thatcher, of course, saw into service over 30 years ago, will be, through its life, the most expensive single project ever undertaken by the British government. And it wouldn't be affordable if we had not together built a strong economy, but it wouldn't be desirable if we didn't conceive of Britain as a major global power ready to shoulder its responsibilities, not just to defend itself, but to uphold the Western values that our democracy, perhaps more than any other, has helped create. So tonight and in the future, Theresa May and the new team she has assembled will have my support. I think she has the strength and the integrity to do the job as she faces up to the great challenge that lies ahead. And as you all know, I fought hard. I fought as hard as I could for a different outcome to the referendum we've just held on our membership of the European Union. I didn't do it by half measures. I couldn't on an issue like that. I put everything on the line, and I don't regret for a moment that I did so. But while I don't resile from any of the concerns that I expressed in advance of that vote, nor do I intend to now or in the future rerun the arguments now the British people have spoken. I count myself extremely fortunate to have been Chancellor Exchequer for 6 years, Shadow Chancellor for 5 years before that, appointed by Michael Howard, and part of David Cameron's team that turned around the fortunes of our party and then of the country. And I feel privileged to be a member of the greatest parliament on earth, representing a beautiful Cheshire constituency with much more to contribute to our nation's discussions in the years ahead. So I look to the future with confidence. Confidence that however great the political challenge, we have a robust democracy that is capable of taking great decisions about our national life in its stride. Confidence that however great the economic challenge, we have an economy that is about as strong a position as it could be in the modern world to cope with what lies ahead. Now, I don't propose tonight to go into detail about how we should approach the next few years. That's rightly for my colleagues in the new team in government to set out. Instead, what I thought I'd do is point to some of the Conservative insights that we should draw our inspiration from, insights that have helped to guide me over the last 11 years. For we have made conscious choices, choices that other governments and oppositions would not have made, choices that other Conservatives would not have made. And I want to point tonight to three in particular before taking your questions. The first choice we made was about the economy. Now, Conservatives understand that without a strong economy, little else is possible. Aspiration, opportunity, improving life chances, these are all the right goals, but they are difficult to achieve if the reality for our citizens are the twin spectres of unemployment and financial crisis. And Conservatives also understand that without strong private business, there is no economic strength. And that is why back in 2010, when Britain was on the economic brink, we took a conscious decision. We were not going to spend ever-increasing sums of borrowed public money trying to support the economy. We were going to create the conditions for a private sector recovery. And the first condition for that is fiscal stability. Business cannot invest or hire people or grow if they think the country will not be able to pay its way in the world. So we Conservatives made another conscious decision. We decided that we would follow the route laid out by Margaret Thatcher rather than by Ronald Reagan. Now, some of you might be surprised to know that there is a distinction, but back in the early 1980s, there certainly was. Ronald Reagan embarked on a series of massive deficit-funded tax cuts. He borrowed to cut taxes. Margaret Thatcher and her Chancellor at the time, Geoffrey Howe, raised taxes. Indeed, the famous 1981 budget, now lauded in the history books, that caused divisions in the cabinet, that attracted the protests of 364 economists, was one of the biggest tax-raising budgets in British history. And that's because, unlike Ronald Reagan, Prime Minister Thatcher did not enjoy the luxury of the world's reserve currency and a near inexhaustible appetite from the world's investors to lend. In her words at the time, she said she was not prepared ever to go on with tax reductions if it meant unsound finance. Now, that first Thatcher government battled to restore sound finances, and as a result laid the foundations for the economic success and the supply-side reforms that were to follow. And we followed that same doctrine of fiscal conservatism in office when we inherited a budget deficit of 11% of national income. That was the highest in our peacetime history. What it means in practice is that you are borrowing £1 for every 4 you're spending on everything. So my first budget raised taxes, notably VAT, and we cut spending. Yet at the same time, we funded major reductions in business tax, taking the corporation tax rate down to the lowest of any major advanced economy in the world. And we also funded the major science and transport investments that would provide a long-term foundation for that private investment. Indeed, in my very first week in office as Chancellor, I rejected the Treasury proposals that we should not go ahead with the Crossrail project, the new Crick Institute for Science, or the Tate Modern extension. They were all offered up as immediate cuts. None had begun, none had started, all could be cancelled, all were simply plans. But I rejected it because in the end, no country thrives if it doesn't build for the future. What we did do is make major reductions in day-to-day current spending. And the share of national income taken by the state fell from over 45% in 2010 to below 40% today. I think it's 38% indeed today. And that is the most sustained reduction in the size of the government we have ever seen. Of course, at the time, we were warned that the private sector would never fill the gap left by the shrinking public sector, that the many hundreds of thousands of jobs lost in government could never be matched by new jobs created by business. Instead, of course, those jobs were matched many times over, And there are 500,000 fewer people today working for the state than when we came to office, but there are 2 million more jobs and 1 million more businesses in our economy. The course we set was clear, but we were always flexible, and the rules allowed for that. When the economy slowed, we slowed the pace of deficit reduction. We let the automatic stabilizers operate. True to conservatism, we were practical, not doctrinaire. But our guiding lights through the storms were the economic stability of sound public finances and a full-throated backing of British business. And I had something else invaluable, the full backing of my next-door neighbour, the Prime Minister. Now, others will pass judgment on our record, but David and I leave office with the country close to full employment, and I believe the economy in better shape than the one we inherited. Now there is a new Chancellor and new economic challenges. Philip Hammond worked with me as my Shadow Chief Secretary for many years when I was Shadow Chancellor. We worked together as close colleagues around the Cabinet table these last 6 years. Not that it was my choice, but there is literally no one I would rather see in number 11 after me than Philip. It's a tough job. He will make his own judgments, and he will have my full backing as he does so. So if the first conscious choice we made was to be fiscally conservative, pro-business, the second conscious choice we made was to seek to be a modern, compassionate Conservative Party at ease with the world. Now, the great Benjamin Disraeli encapsulated in one career the two choices that Conservatives face. Early in his career, he threw his lot in with those who wanted to resist the changes that were then taking place in Industrial Revolution England. People who harked back to a bygone rural idyll that was never coming back and indeed probably never existed. And this group in Parliament had a tremendous time. They thundered against their own Conservative government led by Robert Peel as it tried to repeal the Corn Laws to bring lower food prices to the new industrial poor. They called themselves Young England, and they put the Conservative Party out of office for 3 decades. That is what happens when Conservatives become out of touch and detached from the changes happening in society. And it was an older Benjamin Disraeli who understood that better than anyone. This older Disraeli made bold moves in the face of opposition from refuseniks in his own party to bring early social services to the new urban population, and it was Disraeli who made the dramatic move to extend vastly the franchise to working men in the Second Reform Act. He explained his approach in a speech in Edinburgh in 1867, and he said this: "In a progressive country, change is constant. And the great question is not whether you should resist change which is inevitable, but whether that change should be carried out with deference to the manners, the customs, the laws, and the traditions of a people, or whether it should be carried out in deference to abstract principles and arbitrary and general doctrines." For me, that Disraeli quote encapsulates what successful progressive conservatism is all about, and what distinguishes it both from the reactionary and unsuccessful, and indeed from the arbitrary doctrines of socialism. Of course, Disraeli's approach came to be known as one nation, not a phrase he ever used himself, but one drawn from the way as a novelist he had written about two nations of rich and poor living side by side. Now, we Conservatives are sometimes shy, almost embarrassed about our huge contribution to social progress in Britain. We should not be. Almost 15 years ago, I started to research a book with a friend of mine, who many of you will know, called Daniel Finkelstein. And it was going to set out how great acts of social change actually come about in a parliamentary democracy. Who does them? Who delivers them? How is the vote actually won? And it was going to subtly and incidentally point out that the people who drove these great acts of change were often Conservatives. Now, the book never got written, or maybe it will now. It never got written. I joined the opposition front bench. Daniel started writing in his own name. but the thinking behind it remains core to my beliefs. It was a conservative, William Wilberforce, who ended the slave trade. It was a conservative, Edward Stanley, who then abolished slavery itself. It was a conservative, the Earl of Shaftesbury, who promoted the Factory Acts that limited working hours and banned the employment of young children. It was a conservative, Lord Salisbury, who introduced free elementary education. It was conservatives in government who extended the franchise to working men, and then a conservative Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, that ensured equal votes for women. It was a conservative, Rab Butler, who legislated for universal state education. It was a conservative, Margaret Thatcher, who gave people the right to buy their council homes. It was a conservative, John Major, and his junior minister, William Hague, who introduced the landmark Disability Discrimination Act. And it was a conservative, David Cameron, who introduced equal marriage. Why aren't we prouder of this record as a party? Why don't we shout it from the rooftops? It's made our society stronger and fairer and better. It's been the all too well kept secret of our political success. Last year, more gay people voted for the Conservative Party than any other political party. That is a change that was simply unimaginable when I joined the Conservative front bench over a decade ago. And every single one of those changes may seem now to be entirely sensible and self-evident, but I can tell you, every single one of the changes that I have mentioned was bitterly opposed and objected to, often by fellow Conservatives. Indeed, in my research for the book I never wrote, I discovered that when a young Margaret Thatcher voted to legalize homosexuality, she was one of only a tiny number of courageous Conservative MPs who went into that division lobby. Now we face the great challenges of our age. As Home Secretary, Theresa May has often spoken out against discrimination, and I was hugely encouraged to hear her on the steps of Downing Street last week speaking about her One Nation vision for her government. And she understands that one nation isn't possible if parts of our country feel disconnected from its economic success and disenfranchised from a stake in our society. The regional variation in the referendum result revealed how much more work we have to do, especially in the North and the Midlands. Now, many of the issues I pursued in government will now be for a new set of ministers to pick up. But I remain passionately committed to the Northern Powerhouse, and I will not let go of this. 2 years ago, almost exactly, I spoke in the Power Hall of the Manchester Museum of Science and Industry about how we should address the North-South divide in our economy. Even using the language of North and South, let alone acknowledging a problem, was a striking thing for a Conservative to do. The slogan I coined in that speech, the Northern Powerhouse, has gained more currency than I could possibly have imagined. The other day, I was looking at a new canal attraction in my Northwest constituency, and I was given a big glossy booklet entitled What the Northern Powerhouse Can Do for Our Inland Waterways. And then I turned up in Beijing last year, and there was the Northern Powerhouse in 6-foot-high Chinese characters on a wall. But don't let the success of the slogan betray the seriousness of the idea behind it. The idea is rooted in a solid economic theory that Conservatives should be very comfortable with. It was drawn from various studies, including the work of the Cities Commission that the economist Jim O'Neill chaired, and who I'm delighted to see remains a Treasury Minister. The theory goes like this. Previous attempts by all governments to address the relative underperformance of the north of England have failed because what they've amounted to in the end is moving this Inland Revenue Office over here or that government call centre there from London to some location in the north of England. Or it's involved a grant to build a factory in a former industrial heartland. And I don't disparage those efforts at all. If you visit the Nissan plant in Sunderland, you will see a huge photo of Margaret Thatcher opening it 30 years ago, a classic example, if I might say so, of industrial policy, even if she hated the phrase. But one-off grants or office relocations are never going to change the economic geography of the country. In my view, you have to do much more. You have to devolve economic power to local communities so they do feel more in control, which is why we will now have elections next year for powerful new mayors in almost all of the big city areas of the north of England and the West Midlands. And indeed, in the last couple of weeks I was in office, I agreed new mayoral arrangements in the west of England and in East Anglia too. That is a quiet revolution in local democracy achieved entirely by consent. And then you have to give those communities the tools and the rewards for supporting economic development, which is why we're handing over control of business rates. Now, this is always a touchy subject at a Margaret Thatcher lecture, local government finance. But in 2010, when I became Chancellor, 80% of local council funding came from national government grants. By 2020, 100% of its funding will come from local government taxes. That's another quiet revolution. And then you recognize the fact that these cities are not physically that far away from each other. The distance from Manchester to Leeds is less than the length of the Central Line on the Tube in London. So we've committed to major new transport links, including high-speed rail between these cities. And you then enhance the quality of life in these communities by bringing the benefits of academies to local schools, promoting big science investments in the great universities there, making sure there are major new cultural improvements. In short, you make the north of England a great place to live, to work, and to do business. For that is the key Conservative insight. It cannot be a public sector effort alone. You have to create the conditions for the private sector to flourish and invest to drive the success of the north. And is there much more to do? Yes, of course. We have to make sure the suburbs, the towns, the rural areas of the north feel connected too. We have to make sure the transport projects are now delivered, that the government effort is sustained. And I knew that when I started talking about building a northern powerhouse and trying to turn around 100 years of relative economic decline, it was a tall order. I knew that I would be criticized almost immediately for a lack of instant success. But frankly, I was never interested in occupying high office just to say I did the job. I wanted to take risks and do things that might make a difference. And in 6 years as Chancellor, I regarded it as my job, indeed my duty, to make big, bold decisions to deal with the problems we faced, knowing that not everyone would work and most would be controversial. It's only been 24 months since we started on this great endeavour of the Northern Powerhouse. Now, investment from around the world is flowing into the north of England, and I will do all I can to make sure it continues to be a priority for this one-nation Conservative government. The third and final conscious choice we've made as Conservatives is to be internationalists. And again, there are Conservatives who would choose a different course. In the 18th century, they were called Blue Water Tories. They wanted to spend the largest possible sum on the Navy, and they never wanted to use it. And I can recognise the type in Parliament today. But we are also the party of Pitt's European alliances, Disraeli's Berlin Congress, Churchill's warnings against appeasement and the Iron Curtain, Margaret Thatcher's Atlantic Alliance and South Atlantic success. Now, I became a Member of Parliament shortly before 9/11. And in my first Parliament, when I was sitting in opposition on the backbenches, that whole period was dominated by the build-up to and the aftermath of the Iraq War. And as Chancellor, I sat in the War Cabinet that intervened to prevent a massacre in Benghazi and saw to the overthrow of Gaddafi. My political generation knows the cost of intervention. The lives lost, the controversy caused, the protest marches, and the damning post-mortem reports. It seems so much easier to stay out, to not get involved. Splendid isolationism is what they used to call it. But my generation is also starting now to learn about the cost of non-intervention. The lives lost in the Syrian civil war, the rise of ISIS, the instability across North Africa. I think the vote by the House of Commons in 2013 not to punish Assad for the use of chemical weapons was the worst decision it has made in the 15 years that I have been a Member of Parliament. Britain, perhaps more than any other nation on earth, has shaped the world, its language, its legal and political systems, its culture and its values. We've always been, and we always must remain, in my view, a global power, interested in shaping the world rather than being shaped by it. Now, as we negotiate our exit from the EU, I hope we seek the closest possible ties with our European neighbours. They are, on the economy and on security, our friends, not our foes. I hope we reach out to build stronger economic and trading ties now with our old allies like the United States and our new partners like China. I hope we maintain the 2% of national income I committed us to spend on defence and the 0.7% we also spent on international development. It makes us unique among the major nations with world-besting hard power and world-changing soft power too. A Britain strong at home but also strong in the world. And let me end this Margaret Thatcher lecture with this. Of all the Iron Lady's virtues, her integrity, her strength, her determination, I think the greatest of all was her optimism. She came of political age at a time when people were writing Britain off. We'd lost an empire, but not found a role. Our once mighty industrial economy had become the sick man of Europe. I was a child and then a teenager at the time. And I remember the hankering to return to some bygone age. I remember the Conservatives, who called themselves now, some of them, Thatcherites, but voted against Thatcher in the division lobby night after night, who said it was all much better in 1951 or 1851, anything other than 1981. But not Mrs. T. She was only interested in the future. And she was an optimist. She believed Britain's best days lay ahead. I am an optimist, and so do I. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Right, I think we have time for some questions, do we not?
With your permission. Yes, and I think it would probably help George Osborne if you would stand up, please, if you want to ask him a question, and say your name, and if you represent any organisation, I think he'd find that helpful. There are microphones, so please go ahead.
Who's got a question?
Over
Sir,
there.
gentleman there holding this order paper up.
John Wilden, Global Health Futures. Mr. Osborne, now you're out of office. I just wonder whether you could give us some of your opinion about what you think are the main things that the international and national financial organizations ought to make in the next 5 or 10 years, given that we are really not out of the financial crisis that occurred in 2008?
Well, the major financial institutions actually proved, and the financial system proved pretty robust in the aftermath of the referendum vote. So although financial markets adjusted pretty sharply, there was no financial disorder. Now, we'd done a lot of contingency planning with the Bank of England for that eventuality, and we'd provided liquidity in the market. But the truth was, the system was much stronger than it had been in 2008-9. And I think the key challenge now is going to be, as the memory of the financial crisis starts to fade, to start to forget the lessons of that financial crisis. But the truth is, you need well-capitalized institutions. You need a proper prudential system of making sure that the economy is not creating asset bubbles and the like. And you need a government, or at least in the Bank of England, the power which we've given it to intervene if that's the case. And I thought, two interesting maneuvers by the bank in the last year are worth attention to. And this is, by the way, all entirely a new arrangement that we developed actually in opposition, starting when Michael was the Shadow Chancellor and his successors, to discuss, which was what was the role for the Bank of England in monitoring levels of debt in our economy and how could it act to deal with threats. And it took a decision a year ago to tighten the mortgage lending around buy-to-let mortgages. Lots of outrage in some of the newspapers, but doing exactly what it needed to do, I believe, at that point. And then, in a way more interesting, because that was a straightforward move, it actually reduced the capital requirements on bank lending in the aftermath of the referendum vote. In other words, showing it could move in the other direction as well. And I think that shows we've got a pretty robust financial institution. So financial system, financial institutions broadly robust. Final observation, for me, one of our premier industries is financial services. In its broadest sense, I don't just mean banks and asset managers, but law firms and accountancy firms and shipping brokers and the like. And 2/3 of the people employed in that industry are employed outside the City of London, across our country, in cities up and down and towns up and down Britain. It is very important that that industry is supported and thrives as we go forward. So as we begin to negotiate our exit from the EU, I would want to see the maximum possible access for our financial services and vice versa with European companies, and an understanding that in the end, London has a huge amount going for it as a global financial center, and the choice for the whole of Europe is not whether that moves to some other European capital, because I don't think it will, but whether it moves out of Europe altogether, and I don't think that's in the interests of any European country. Who's got another question? Henry.
George, you articulated very well the importance of foreign investment in Britain, but in the time of your administration, you never seemed to be very interested in British investment overseas, other than financial services. And my experience has been that the merchants trading overseas have enormous potential and enormous power, enormous soft power, but that government doesn't seem to understand that, I'm afraid. But perhaps I'm wrong.
Well, I think I'd make two observations about that. I mean, first of all, you have to try and focus your efforts and your resources where you've got a problem. And our problem has not been overseas British investments into other countries. Indeed, your company is a brilliant example, whether it's investment in China or Indonesia or elsewhere. That was not our challenge. Our challenge as an economy has been we don't export enough. And so we did direct our efforts of our UK export arm, UKTI, towards exports rather than assisting British investment overseas, because to be honest, that would look like it was doing pretty well by itself. And I'm a believer, as you might expect as a Conservative, that government steps in when there's a problem, not when there's not a problem. And then second, again, to be completely candid with you, our challenge with our balance of payments was trying to attract investment into the UK. Our challenge was we were earning a lot on our investments. The overseas investment into Britain was fine, and it was earning a lot, but our investment overseas was not earning quite so much. We wanted to attract more of that investment because actually we thought that would make our current account deficit at least more robust, if not reduce the number, because it would spread our investments. And we did encourage it. And you know better than anyone, the Chinese investment, for example, into the United Kingdom has been very substantial. And I can take you to parts of Manchester and Leeds and the like, which have received very substantial sums of money and are physically transforming the cityscape. So I'm sorry we didn't do everything, but we focused where we thought the priorities lay. Who's got another question? Lady here in the second row.
Thank you. Adriana Enab. The UK has done quite a lot to make big strides in making London the financial fintech capital of the world. What do you think, how will that be affected now with leaving the EU?
Well, look, as I say, I think we should be seeking the closest possible economic ties with our near neighbours. And they are, where over 40% of our exports go anyway. And they're always going to be very important markets to us. And I also think it's in the whole of Europe's interests that that is the case. It's not just a British interest. And if indeed you can take a classic British conservative theory around free trade to show that it's in the interests of all these countries, rather than taking a sort of mercantilist view that there's a fixed pie and, you know, if some European country gets a bit more of it, Britain will get less, and that's a good thing for that European country. I don't think that's the case. You know, I think it's in the interest of the whole of Europe to create as strong and as integrated an economy as possible. And fintech is a very good example of that. Again, you know, financial technology, this is the application, for those who don't know, of essentially the amazing changes we've seen in technology to finance, flourishes in the UK, partly because we've got a very strong tech sector, which is one of the recent developments of the British economy, but also because we've got a very strong financial sector. The challenge, I remember over several years, is not, is that going to happen here or in some other European capital? It is it going to happen here or is it going to happen in California? And, you know, I think, again, that's a classic example of where some sensible government support, work with the financial institutions that represent the City of London, work with the tech companies, and we can create something really impressive for Europe. Who's got another question? Let's take, we should take one a bit further back, shouldn't we? There's a gentleman right at the back there. In his...
Hi, Mr. Osborne. My name's Billy Hill from the One campaign. Actually, personally wanted to thank you for your leadership on international development. That 0.7 commitment has put 11 million kids in school and vaccinated 43 million people against preventable disease. Post-Brexit, what advice would you give the government in sort of tackling those international issues, extreme poverty, climate change, conflict? Where do you see the UK's role in shaping the world, as you say?
Yeah, look, I don't think it should be particularly affected by Brexit. I think it's, as I said in my remarks, I think it's a very important part of our international identity now. We are the only major country in the world that spends 2% of our national income on defence and 0.7% of our national income on international development. There are some countries that spend 0.7 on international development, some countries that spend 2% on defence. No major country, no large economy that does both. And of course, you know, the clue's in the numbers. We spend a lot more on defence than we do on international development, but nevertheless, it's a substantial commitment. And it not only saves lives in the way that you have described, and that is a right and moral and good thing for this country to do, but I think it does also advance our interests. And I'm quite blunt about that. I think, you know, it is in our interest to bring stability to places in the world that are a source not just of great misery for the people living there, but great pressure on us, whether it's in security terms or migration terms, if they're not solved. I mean, what is the lesson? I mean, and how many more reports do we need to have, like Chilcot, that say we're all very good at fighting these wars and we're not very good at dealing with the situation afterwards? And then in the same breath, you get people saying, but we shouldn't spend the same amount of money on international development. You know, I don't think that makes sense. And, you know, actually, the new government doesn't need any advice from me, but on this issue. But they I think, have made it clear that they remain committed to our manifesto commitment. Who's got another question? Let's take another couple of questions. Sir, with the orangish tie. That's right.
My name's Hugo de Berg. Even before Brexit, you were advocating a partnership with China, and I think you were very responsible for our involvement with the AIIB. Now, since Brexit, presumably this partnership is potentially much more important. So, apart from inward investment to the UK, what forms do you think this partnership might take, and how might we realize it?
Well, no, I did a lot with my colleagues in government to advance the relationship with China and make it less transactional and more of a proper, broad relationship that you would have with a key nation around the world. It's not going to replace the United States as a key friend, but it's a very big, important part of our global economy and an increasingly important part of the global security system. And I think our relationship is paying off. I think we have been able to not only attract investment and increase trade and the like, but actually, if you take the example of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, this was a new institution that China created or sponsored, a new multilateral institution. And because Britain was one of the founding members, we were actually pretty influential in the best traditions of the British Foreign Office and Treasury Civil Service of shaping the articles of agreement and the rules of how the institution would operate, drawing on 2 centuries of experience of putting together these multilateral arrangements. And so that, that to me was an example of Britain deploying its influence and its know-how and its expertise, not just to its commercial advantage, but actually to the best interests of a more stable and prosperous world. And I would say this, there's a choice with China. It's a big feature of our life. It's going to become, probably in our lifetimes, the largest economy in the world. And it has strong regional interests. Now, we can either fail to deal with that, fail to manage that. As, by the way, throughout history, we have often failed to manage emerging powers. Or we can try and bind it into the international system that we have helped shape with our friends in Europe and the United States, and make it feel that that system works for it. And I'll give you 2 examples. The International Monetary Fund eventually increased its quota, or the way it weighted the votes, so that China had a bigger seat at the table. But it took years. And if you're China, you're thinking, well, if this International Monetary Fund is not going to be working for us, why do we want to be so involved in it? But in that case, actually, the world saw sense, in my view, and the US Congress has just passed the ratification that allows that to take place. When you take the Asia Development Bank, which is not the same as the AIIB, actually it was rather slow to react to the rise of China, thought it could basically keep China out, or certainly away from the very top table. And what did China go and do? Create a parallel institution that it felt gave it a proper seat at the table. I think it's massively in Britain's interests, and I would say in France and Germany's interests, I know their ambassadors are here, in America's interest, that we bring China into the international system. And it is not in our interest that it feels that its perfectly legitimate economic weight is not recognized, but its legitimate expectations, given its weight and importance in the world, are not recognized by those institutions. Sorry, a rather long answer, but let's take a final couple of questions. Is that right? Sure. Should we do Sir on the end there, in the glasses? Right by the microphone. Familiar face.
Yes, I'm Patrick Evershed. I'm president of the Cities of London and Westminster Conservatives. And first of all, I'd like to congratulate you for having left us with a very, very strong economy, having inherited a most incredible mess. You've done a brilliant job. But the thing that's worrying me, or one of the things that's worrying me, is the very low savings ratio we have in the UK. It's down to about 4% now, compared with something like 40% in China. And as a result of this, we're having to depend more and more on overseas investment to pay for our capital investment here. I'm wondering whether this worries you and whether you think anything can be done to increase our savings ratio in the UK.
Yeah. I mean, it's a big challenge, is the short answer, Patrick. There's no simple lever, though I tried several, that a chancellor has to increase the amount of savings in the economy, apart from, a financial crisis is quite good for the savings ratio. It's not a route you want to ever go down. So what I tried to do as chancellor was, particularly in a low interest rate environment, which is clearly going to be around for a considerable period of time. In that, I was trying all sorts of tax incentives and essentially more attractive savings vehicles. So whether it was the pension freedoms in 2013 that gave people access to their pensions to make pension saving more attractive, whether it's this lifetime saving account, which I introduced in the last budget, so that people could feel they could save for a home and for a pension. And these were all attempts by the Treasury and by me as Chancellor to create more attractive savings vehicles and to use quite a lot of government money to subsidize that, essentially. And that was the best route that I had to trying to increase household savings. Interestingly, during this period, the overall levels of household debt did decline, and the borrowing became more secure and so on, partly because of financial regulation. So, although there's a huge amount of work to do, we did make some progress. Should I take one final question? Should I take a question from you, sir, in the check shirt?
My name is Richard Edmonds. I suppose if I represent anybody, I represent my children. They were massively disappointed on that Friday morning, massively, deeply upset. I wonder, now that you haven't got such a prominent role in the organization of our government any longer, do you think that there are certain markers that I should be telling them about their future, given that Margaret Thatcher was interested in the future, and the future is our children?
Well, I hardly presume to give advice to my own teenage children rather than anyone else's children. Look, I think, as I say, I'm not going to rehearse the arguments of the referendum. The British people have spoken. We take that as an instruction to deliver. But clearly there is now an opportunity to reach out beyond Europe, around the world. And, when I was growing up, it was very much, there was Britain and there was Europe and maybe there was also the United States. I'm very struck now for my children, how they think about Asia and how they understand that's a big feature of the world they're growing up in. And I don't just mean China here, I also mean India and other Asian countries. I think Britain now needs to, play all the cards it's got and get out there, get on the aeroplanes, Cam Force One or whatever it's now going to be called, and get the business delegations out there to these emerging economies and to traditional friends of ours, and forge new trading and economic ties. That's the opportunity we've got to make the most of. And in the end, the referendum result, not the one, as I say, I campaigned for, can be interpreted in two ways. And I guess what my lecture was trying to steer people in one direction. You can either see it as Britain retreating from the world, turning in on itself, no longer wanting to shoulder its global responsibilities, or you can take it as a vote for Britain being a bigger global player and more outward-looking and more global-facing. And that is the Britain that I'm going to be fighting for. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'll just invite them to come and have a drink.
Right. Thank you very much.
To everyone here, thank you very much for coming. That's been a brilliant lecture by George Osborne, and he and the many directors of the Centre for Policy Studies and the director Tim Knox would like to ask you to come and join us for a glass at the back of the Great Hall. Thank you very much for coming.